Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Leadership in a Digital Age webinar hosted by the CMI Northern Ireland Board. I should be handing over to Gemma and Rolly to begin this evening event. I would like to remind you that if you got any questions during the webinar, you can ask them using the live chat box on the right of your screen, and we shall answer as many as we can during the Q&A. Today's session is being recorded and it will be shared with you tomorrow for those who book to attend. The event recording will also be available on the CMI website and CMI YouTube channel. Now over to Gemma Jordan, Chair of the CMI Northern Ireland Board, and Rolly Shaw, General Counsel at Fintru. Enjoy the evening.
Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for attending this evening. As mentioned, I'm Gemma Jordan. I am the Chair of the NI Regional Board for CMI, and this is Northern Ireland Regional Board's first digital event. So thank you everyone for coming along, and thank you Rolly for attending, for speaking for us. We've been discussing potential topics for this event and what we felt would be the most relevant. And leadership in a digital age felt like a really important topic to be talking about at this time, especially after what's happened over the past 12 months. When we look at the stats on this, if you look at the stats in December 2019, about 5% of the UK population would have said that they mainly worked from home or were remote workers. When we got to April 2020, so only 4 months on from that, 50% of the working population would have considered themselves that. So as you can see, obviously a massive increase. Obviously we know why, but in a very short space of time. And as a result of this, management and leadership have had to really rethink how they engage with their workforce and increase their digital engagement, which has been a major evolution for management and leadership, not only in the UK but also globally. We have Rolly Shaw here today with us, as mentioned, so General Counsel for Fintru. Fintru is a RegTech business based here in Northern Ireland. They have over 700 employees. And they had to react really quickly at the start of the first lockdown to mobilise their workforce remotely and offer a new kind of leadership in this digital environment. So Rolly will take us through how they managed the opportunities and challenges of this way of work, with specific focus on the changes they had to make to things like induction, training, communication, embedding culture, employee wellbeing, as well as a number of other areas. So we'll have a short video first, just to give you a flavour of what Fintru do. And then Rolly will take it from there. So please sit back and relax. Please post any questions that you have into the chat as we go along, and we'll get to those at the end.
Thank you, Gemma. If you just bear with me a second, I'll get the presentation up. Okay, so I'd just like to start off by thanking CMI for inviting myself and Fintru to present to you tonight. is an honor, and as Gemma kindly gave me the introduction there, I thought it would be good to share some of our experiences and our journey over the last 12 months, both in terms of reacting to the COVID pandemic and also, pursuing our own growth strategy and development as a company. So, look, my name is Rolly Shaw. I'm the General Counsel for Fintru, which is primarily focused on serving the financial services industry. But our clients are typically global clients, but we do all of the servicing from Northern Ireland. So already, hopefully, you can feel that we have this concept of working remotely, albeit in our own offices, and probably you'd have seen some of the video there that really has been quite a rapid expansion for us, and we're quite an ambitious company, and we want to continue to grow and evolve our services, mainly from Northern Ireland. But I guess we rethink that a bit as COVID has happened and maybe other opportunities have opened. But you can see that 2019 to 2020 has probably been the largest period of growth. So during 2020, we've grown, yet we've done that largely through a remote environment. And as a company, we sat down probably around this time last year, or just earlier than this time last year, to come up with our strategy, and we'd really set our target to try and grow to 600 people by the end of 2020. And that was before the pandemic hit. And then when the pandemic hit, we were kind of left with a decision: do we try and consolidate and protect what we have, or do we try and continue with our strategy? And we decided that actually we owed it to ourselves, we owed it to our local community as well. I think there's, within our company anyway, we realized quite early on that this was probably going to be a longer term thing and not something that lasted for a month or two, and that some industries would be quite severely impacted. But we were quite comfortable and confident that our own industry would be able to withstand the pandemic conditions. So we decided to proceed with our growth strategy rather than consolidating. And I think that was obviously borne out looking back at the growth we've had and the success we've had. But it also created, I think the pandemic, would be remiss of me to say that didn't create opportunity for us. Our clients are global investment banks, largely work in the financial hubs, densely populated areas might be quite, heavily impacted by lockdowns and things like that. So, we kind of saw this as a potential opportunity as well to grow. And interestingly, what we found was it was easier to get access to our key stakeholders within our clients when they were working at home, because they didn't have the distraction or the busyness of the busy office environment that they worked in. And maybe actually they were quite appreciative of the contact, from people like ourselves. So we found that gave us maybe an easier in to do our business development with those clients. I think the video probably summed up this slide anyway, but I think one of the key things to sort of mention is that we were an organization that was 100% office based. So we did not have a flexible work environment, and that was really driven by client needs and information security. So our offices are very, very secure, and our staff, if you work for a client, you only work for that client, and you will only have the access to dedicated parts of the building where we service that client from. So there's no, I guess, cross-contamination, and we're trying to restrict, any data leakages or information leakages. So, going from that environment to everyone working from home was a big challenge for our clients to get their heads around, but also a big challenge for us, because it wasn't people maybe doing 2 days at home or suddenly doing 4 or 5 days at home. So everything we used to do was done in the offices, and now it all had to be done remotely. the sort of top right quadrant of that slide is really around what we call as our academies, and that's our graduate programs. And we rely very, very heavily on recruiting graduates to fuel our growth. We're quite a process-driven company, and actually the graduate marketplace is very attractive for us, and it's very attractive for our clients. And being based in Northern Ireland, we have an excellent pool of graduates. I think the probably if the next slide really sort of demonstrates that, and I guess the senior associates, and analysts are the more junior roles within the company, and you can kind of see the numbers involved there. So we have a very young population. Typically employees are in their 20s or early 30s. And we were very mindful of that when we had to shift from what was a very heavily controlled environment in our offices to suddenly working, remotely. And for a lot of people who work for us, it's maybe their first or their second ever job. And we've always prided ourselves on our culture, which is very, very important, and it's a very inclusive environment. So, to create that inclusivity is kind of easier when you're all there physically together. And whether you're an analyst or a managing director of the firm, everyone has access to each other, and it's that very inclusive culture that we were very, very keen to protect. But we realized very early on that this young population, we had to almost like know our audience. We know our employees. We've got this very young population, this young workforce, and what did that mean for us in terms of converting to a remote environment? I'm very privileged to own my own house and have the privacy and the space to work from home, and also maybe the equipment, but that's not necessarily the case for people with lots of student loans or house sharing. So we had to take that into consideration with everything we do. It's a young workforce, so we had to take a leap of faith to trust our staff to work from home and continue to deliver for the clients. But also with that young workforce, they're in the early stages of their career, and that there's a steep learning trajectory and professional development trajectory. So, very focused on how do we maintain that. And what worked in our advantage was that most of our staff are pretty tech savvy. So it was really the more senior in age staff that maybe would have struggled with the utilizing the technology most appropriately. And I think one of the biggest challenges for us initially was getting our clients comfortable about information security, and that would have driven some of our strategy around how did we equip people to work from home. So a wee bit more on that. So as a company, we've got 4 guiding principles, and we try to enshrine these in everything we do. And those are people, passion, partnership, and professionalism. And we want to bring all of those things to everything we do. And whether that's transitioning to a remote workplace or even doing a piece of work or developing a training program or something, we try to bring all of those things in. And this really fuels our culture. And I've used that word a couple of times already, but it is very, very important to us. Our culture, we want people to come and work for Findru because it's culturally a very good place to work. And how do we do this with this 100% remote working from home environment? I've mentioned that we didn't have really the experience or that we had this heavily controlled working environment, and we had to go to something that was so much more flexible. And I think if I can look back on the last 12 months, we've probably seen 3 phases of this: the transition to remote working, when we took that leap of faith and gave the trust of our staff. I mean, we very much did not adopt a big brother attitude. So as we have the technology to monitor people's activity, and that we didn't need to do that because of the nature of our work and what we provide for our clients. They're paying for our services, and they want to know what we're doing for them. So we're a very, performance KPI based company. So in a sense, that monitoring was, happens whether you're in the office or whether you're working from home. But we found very much through that first phase, productivity actually increased and increased quite significantly. And that was great, obviously for us, and it was great for our clients. But what, it did sort of maybe create some potential problems down the line. And this was really around, we were starting to consider, are people just working more because they're at home and they're restricted in their other activities? So, a lot of focus on, like, what is the right work-life balance, to try and ensure, that people have the right separation from work and, and their home life. And again, the young population, people house sharing, that's much harder to achieve than, some of the people who are further on in life who have their own house and maybe have the luxury of a home office, so can walk out of there and leave work behind more easily. Then probably the next phase was more that kind of realization, frustration, and we noticed that productivity started to plateau and that people weren't taking their annual leave. And that was, really important for us to try and encourage people for their own sake and for their well-being to take annual leave. But also as a company, we had to be conscious of the fact that, if everything opened up again, we couldn't have the whole company taking lots and lots of holidays, because then our services to our clients stop. So we're constantly trying to look forward, to identify trends or problems. So we quite quickly implemented if people wanted to sell back some of their holidays, we'll buy them back off them. Or, we'd already made it clear that we weren't going to mandate that people take holidays, but strongly encourage that they should, even if it's a day here and a day there, for their own sake, and that they try and utilize it, appropriately. I don't log in for an hour just because you've a couple of things to do. And that was probably quite important. We also allowed people to carry over days into the next year, but again, always balancing that with their own well-being. It is not healthy not to take your holidays or to sell them all back, or anything like that. So we did put some limits around that, and it wasn't driven by financial or client need. It was really all driven by employee well-being. And I think probably the next phase, and the phase we're in at the moment, is potential fatigue with COVID, not so much with working from home, but this sort of almost this Groundhog Day feeling. And I think there's probably a feeling that 2021 hasn't really started yet, that it's just a continuation of this nightmare that was 2020. So already this year we've kind of undergone a bit of a campaign to try and refresh and rejuvenate some of the things I'm going to talk about later. But it's like, for an example, is we've kind of said, look, 12 to 2 is a period in each day that we shouldn't have any meetings set up. Client meetings fine, but no internal meetings. Don't set them up during those times, to try and give people that space, that actually if they want to engage with some of their colleagues on a more social level, like they might do in the office, during lunch breaks and things like that, that they can do that. And really just trying to keep thinking of ways to replicate the office environment, or what people can get out of working in an office environment. So I think during this phase of growth, we would have had a lot of new people who've never worked for Fintree before, so they'd no idea, what it's about. We pride ourselves on our culture, but what does that really mean to them? They've never even been in one of our buildings. Quite often, all of the interviewing and stuff would have been done through video technology. So the first thing we kind of did with in this aspect was, we revamped our induction. So, we're fortunate in the sense that we run our inductions weekly because we have new people starting with us every week. And we went through a process of trying to get feedback from all of our new staff, after 2 weeks and maybe after, 2 months, constantly trying to learn, like, what do we do really well that we can do more of? What do we do not so well that we need to improve on? You know, really focused on, the managers and the employees within the teams that new staff would go into, to make sure that they had organized meetups and touch points, almost like a more formal buddy system. So, if they had any questions constantly, could go to them in the way they would just speak to the person next to them in an office environment. We did set up, sort of like an organized meetup for teams, in groups within the office, but we actually had to cancel them because the restrictions increased again. So it became, essential journeys only. But if that hadn't happened at that stage, we would have sort of, had these, come and work in the office for a day, but, have an organized meetup around it. We mentioned earlier about the inclusive culture. So things like trying to, organize, like we set up something called True Networking, and there would be different limbs to that, but it was very much, trying to build a network outside of the team that you work in on a day-to-day basis. So, we had a thing called Meet the Executive Committee. So every member of the executive committee of the company will have a one-to-one with a new employee, whether they're in their area or not, just to welcome them, to introduce themselves, introduce their, the other exco members, just to try and make people feel like they're involved. We were very fortunate to have, invested quite heavily in a marketing team, and really they took over when it came to trying to recreate the office environment, but in a virtual scenario. And some of the things that they would have come up with would have been doing a lot of research, around, training and tips for working from home. So you can see in the slide there, 7 tips for working from home, but we have to be flexible. We recognize that everyone's different. Everyone has a different home life, different challenges at home. So we have to be as flexible as we can, and that flexibility even included, when the restrictions allowed, was like making the office available for people, that actually if they were struggling at home, that they could come to the office for a day or for a week, for the sake of their own well-being. One thing that we were very conscious of was video fatigue or Zoom fatigue. So whilst we were pushing quite strongly the virtual meetings, have your camera on, see people, keep connected, keep engaged, we wanted those meetings to become effective and not be too taxing on people. So, if a meeting was typically an hour in the office, we maybe encourage people to see if they could do it for half an hour. Ran a lot of training around how to run effective virtual meetings, make them much more action-based, to the extent that, attendees can be prepared when they come, rather than let the meeting just, organically, take itself in a particular direction. So that would have been very important. I think the key point that we did that allowed us to continue our services was we invested really heavily in technology, hardware and software. And I think everyone probably remembers where you couldn't get a toilet roll in the supermarket. And I think we realized pretty soon that, in our world, that could be, not being able to get laptops or computers or monitors or, the various hardware that people needed to work at home. So given that we had quite ambitious growth plans anyway, we just bulk bought up front, swallowed the cost up front, and therefore we had all of the equipment, and we had empty offices to store the equipment in. So, I guess our security guys quickly became, reinvented themselves as delivery guys, and we delivered everyone, Fintry owned hardware. And that was important so that people had had the equipment to work effectively from home, but also we had, more comfort around the information security, and we were able to say to our clients, look, everyone has Fintry devices. They're all disabled for all of these things that would be of concern to you and concern to us. We probably did a lot of work around, not just working remotely, but managing remotely and training people on how to do that effectively, how to have, if it's a monthly one-to-one conversation, how to have that more, more appropriate in a video scenario rather than in a one-to-one person scenario. We did impress the need to maintain team meetings, to almost like not let them just drop by the wayside, because actually they're key for keeping the staff engaged and in touch. And also really important to, bring the new staff who've never experienced working for Fintry, to give them the real feel for it and keep them engaged, to give them the feel for what it's like to work for us. I think probably on a point of reflection, COVID in one way probably forced us to think more creatively, and I think we were very creative. We prioritize people's well-being and our employees' well-being, and a lot of our initiatives that we've done, and I'll sort of demonstrate over the next couple of slides, were really focused on well-being. What do people miss doing? What has been the impact? So we recognize ourselves as individuals that people's sleep was being disrupted, whether it was through the stress of COVID, the stress of working from home, managing, homeschooling, but it's just maybe spending so much time on computers, more likely. So we brought James Wilson in, the sleep geek, and he ran a series of programs, which, and presentations, which we ran through the winter quite deliberately as part of our Bounce Through Winter program. A couple of the other things we would have done around the well-being piece was obviously managing your mental health. So that was very much targeted at each individual employee. Some of the tips around it, and in particular, if you're struggling, to put your hand up. But we also did a lot of work with our managers, in terms of how do you manage, your team remotely, and maybe how do you recognize some of the signs. And again, we were bringing experts in from outside, investing in the external training. So that was really quite successful, because the reality is that this has been very, strenuous on people's mental health, and nobody is immune from that. I think the modern world is so much more digital and less relationship based than previously, and we were quite keen to run something around digital detox, as it was called. So the digital ninja, Wayne Denner, came in quite recently and did a presentation to, it was available to all staff. These sorts of things are kind of important. Maybe people are spending all of their time on a computer, but actually a lot of their life outside of work is on computers or on tablets or in digital formats and that. So it was just, trying to keep people, I guess, in touch with maybe the outside world as well a bit. Some of the other things we did in our Bounce Through Winter program was we ran like a nutrition course. So we had Jane McClanahan from Vital Nutrition came in, and that was really about, just maybe what foods are good for you, maybe what, not simply not trying to tell people how to eat or to diet, but actually, what can be quite energetic or stimulating foods, or, maybe if you've got more time, you're not buying your sandwich or, something from the local spar shop or the hot food counter, that you actually can spend a bit more time preparing food for yourself. We probably would have been beneficiaries of the good weather, and that allowed us to run to some fun competitions internally, but they were really focusing on trying to get people outside, trying to encourage people to go for a walk at lunchtime, and we kind of combined that with some of our charitable initiatives. So it was really about walking or running 2020 kilometers or miles in the month of May was one thing we did, and set up a company Strava group, and everyone could log their walks or their runs and things like that. But just trying to keep that level of engagement whilst at the same time encouraging good practice from a well-being perspective. Walk and talk was another initiative. If you're out, you should be able to out for a walk, you can kind of connect in with colleagues, kind of remotely through your phones or whatever, but just really just trying to keep mixing it up, trying to keep people engaged, keep people in touch. And I guess as COVID became more of a reality and more of a norm, the technology was forever improving. So as a company, we used Microsoft Teams. We'd used that prior to any lockdown, but actually how that piece of software evolved and its functionality was great. So it was always sort of trying to keep in touch with that, trying to update people how, maybe new functions on it, or, that could benefit us. And it was the same, maybe around the more social aspects of working at somewhere like Fintrue. So we were always a very social company. We had lots of social committees, be it sports clubs, book clubs, and that we wanted to make sure that none of that suffered. That was very important from our cultural perspective. So, what were the virtual initiatives that we could come up with? And again, this is where the marketing team kind of went into overdrive. We wanted to make sure that, we still did have our summer party, albeit remote, on a virtual basis. So how did we do that? Encourage people to spend their social budget. So rather than going out for a meal together, it was everyone was given, vouchers. They could order the food they wanted in and order wine or whatever they wanted in and still have the night, virtually. It's not quite a substitute for the real thing, but it's still, still all played its part, just some other things, that we would have done, we would have had a Friday playlist, encourage people to have the playlist on in the background, when they're working on Fridays. Obviously, if they've got client calls or things like that, to switch it off. But if it's just themselves working away, just really just trying to encourage people to look after themselves and try and make their lives as easy as possible. And I think that's really what it was all about. Like recognizing that, yes, we're a commercial organization and we want to be successful and make money and grow and develop, but actually, at the moment we really are a very people-based organization, and without our people, we can't be as successful. We can't deliver to our clients. Whilst we rely heavily on technology, we're not a technology company per se. We embed technology in our services, but we're not out there selling our technology. So our people are key to us, and we had to ensure the well-being of them. And it was really just trying to encourage people at all levels to be as creative as possible. That if they had an idea, be it for a social event, be it cocktail making parties, a lot of the marketing team did a lot of work in terms of researching how to have a virtual team event. What are the activities that you could do, whether that was using technology or whether that was having a virtual cocktail making class or wine tasting evening or anything like that. So that was a huge focus, was really just to keep that level of engagement, make sure that all of our committees, be them social, or around our Pride committee or True Allies, women in finance, all of these things had to continue. With big focus of the company has always been the work we do within the community, the work we do for our local charities. And we're kind of a lot of thought about, well, this is very important to our staff. We know that especially the young population, these CSR type things are really, really important, and therefore we had to find ways to continue to do that. So I think I mentioned the 2020 in May. We also opened up our New York office this year, so we ran a similar thing. That could we, as a company, walk to New York and back in terms of the miles, and the company agreed to donate £1 for every mile that we walked, and that's, so we were able to continue to run a lot of our charitable work, our I guess our fundraising activities. So it's been a hell of a year, both commercially, but also in terms of trying to manage and lead our staff through these times. I think we just really tried to explore ways to make people's lives as easy as possible. If people didn't have a good environment to work from home in, then how could we improve that for them? Did that mean send them in a desk, or an appropriate desk chair so that they had comfort rather than sitting on a sofa chair to work on a laptop on their knee the whole time? So what flexibility could we do? And I think we're already sort of seeing that maybe our clients' appetite to have this very, very secure environment is possibly changing, and that gives us opportunity to get back to, when we get back to some level of normality, it may not be that we go back to the way we were before. It may be much more of a hybrid model between being able to offer this flexibility for people to work from home at times, or as a norm for maybe 2 to 3 days a week. So that's really all I had, in terms of the presentation. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you for that. I think we'll just start on then with some questions, if that's okay, Rolling.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So we've had quite a number. You've answered quite a few as we've went along, so I will I'd try to keep it as relevant as possible. A few follow-on questions from some things that you've asked or discussed. So for example, you're talking about like the effective one-to-one meetings that you have been having digitally, and some of the hints and tips that you've given to your team about how to do that better digitally when it's a wee bit different to being in the office. Is there a few of those that you could share with us, maybe?
Yeah, so I think look, we do encourage, obviously, to have the video and the video meetings. We also would have encouraged people, so we would have our own internal HR system. I guess in pre-COVID world, you had the meeting, and then the notes of the meeting were updated and in the system afterwards, whereas we kind of reverse that round, so that at least it's back to it's not that it's like any other meeting, but it is still a meeting. So to the extent both people can be prepared more properly for it, so all of that stuff was done beforehand. The system would have been updated, the notes, the employees' notes, the manager's notes, and then the meeting would be had, and that would have been run through. So it just gives the meeting structure. Mm-hmm. It's almost like an automatic agenda. So and the system, we were quite fortunate with our timing, because we actually implemented a new system during the course of the new year. So we were, part of the implementation, we were able to mold that a bit more to remote scenarios, and that. So that was a fortune for us, but that would have been pretty important. And not to hide, it's the same with any meeting, whether it's in person or not, but we want all of our staff to develop, and it's important that managers own the conversations, whether that's in video or not, and I guess, I think one of the big things about video is you hear and see, you hear the same, but you see less. You only see this much of me. You can't assess my body language from, below my chest. And that's just to be a bit more, cognizant of that, of like what the body language is really telling you.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you for that. Yeah, in our organization, they say to ask twice, ask how somebody is twice. Because the first time they'll say, yeah, I'm grand. And it's only when you ask the second time that they actually tell you. And when you can't see
Yeah.
body language like that, because you're only saying from here up, it does seem to help. And I've noticed people using it actually, and you do actually stop yourself and don't just say that, yeah, it's all good. You know, you do actually answer properly. So that we found that a useful tip. In terms of, I know you'd said you have quite a young workforce. I take it you do still have people with who are homeschooling children and things like that. Have you had to work that flexibility in then as well? What type of things have you been doing to help with that?
Absolutely. So we would have encouraged, so one of the slides would have seen a picture of what we call a town hall, and that's really a company-wide meeting. So at our town halls, in theory, everyone's in the company's in attendance. So we would have encouraged people that if they have a challenge, to make sure they speak up to their manager. So, if they need flexibility around doing the school run or homeschooling, if they need, to sort of say, look, I need 9 to 11 just to be my time. And I'm really sorry, I know that's quite often a busy time for work. That's okay. As long as we know and we can manage that, manage client expectations. Because fortunately for us, the clients are in the same boat. So quite often the mornings aren't quite as busy from a communication perspective as they used to be, because all our clients are trying to do the homeschooling and that as well. So, but yeah, I mean, I think the key thing is that people feel empowered to be able to put their hand up and say, I need help or I need flexibility.
Yeah, great. I know. Actually, one of the great things I think that's come out of this is that typically within a lot of organizations, when you talked about flexibility and any type of home working or anything along those lines, it was about mums and, flexibility around school runs and things like that. And I think the fact that everybody has now experienced it, hopefully going forward will make it, everybody's flexibility rather than just focusing on one group of people, and then it almost kind of stigmatizes in some respects as well. So I think it's been great from that perspective. Yeah. A couple of questions then as well around work-life balance. So you'd said at the start of lockdown you'd seen an increase in productivity and then that kind of plateaued a wee bit. I've heard of this from a number of organizations as well who've kind of said, people didn't really have anything else to do, or a lot of their other activities had kind of, they couldn't do anymore, whether it's going to play golf or some other form of sport or whatever, that had kind of been taken away from them. So they've been focusing a bit more on work as a result. How have you managed to balance that for people and ensure that work-life balance is there?
I think you just have to be quite persistent. So, we have to let them know what our expectations of them is, and that is, that we need them to work their working day, but it doesn't have to be between 9 and 5 or whatever, your standard normal hours would have been, but that actually we would expect that they would take care of themselves. So, we do have people who by nature would have been ferociously hardworking and they might not have noticed a difference. But maybe some people who were just sort of bored and they were like, what? So we would have tried to run little things about, even like suggestion things on our Yammer sort of internal social media style thing, around like Netflix series recommendations, even, people sharing how they're spending their time, encourage people that, if they're doing something that's just a bit different or even out for a walk, just, take a picture, and just sort of to try and remind people, that if they're getting stuck into a rut, that maybe it's, like we encourage people to take that 12 to 2 thing, to almost, that's kind of like your sanctuary. Use it to make sure you take your hour for lunch, and maybe check in with a couple of your current teammates or people that you used to work on other teams with and that. So but it is, I think, maybe the burden of expectation that younger people have on themselves was something that we probably learnt during the course of this, that actually, that they would be expected to do all of this anyway. Well, you're at home anyway, you're not out playing golf because the golf courses are closed, so why wouldn't you log on and do an extra hour or two of work? And it's sort of, maybe we would have just maybe taken that for granted at the very start, and we became sort of aware. I would say our productivity was increased in the early days was partly driven by enthusiasm as well. This was, yeah, something that always, people would have always wanted, that flexibility to work from home. But there would have certainly been an element where people were working longer hours than they typically would in the normal environment.
Yeah. I think our organisation's the same. We've really noticed that role modelling from senior leadership is really important in terms of ensuring that people realise that it's fine. Like in ours, all senior leaders would post pictures of themselves on our internal social media of them out for walks during working hours, so it's very clear that it's okay to do, and we all need to clear our heads sometimes, and that's the best way to do it. And we, as you talked about, technology fatigue there, we're all sitting at screens all day. And where previously we would have been walking between meetings and going to people's desks to have a discussion, and that doesn't happen anymore. So ensuring that you have that release and have that walk around, and like we were talking the other day to somebody about your number of steps, and there's certain days where like I wouldn't even hit 1,000 because like I don't even leave the house. It's terrible. Whereas on a typical day at work, I would have done probably 4,000 just from getting into the car, getting there, walking to get some lunch, all those kind of things I just don't do anymore. So yeah, I think that role modeling piece is really important to making sure that people keep that balance. In terms of recruitment then, obviously you had a major recruitment drive there in 2020. How was that all managed remotely then? Was it all in interviews done online?
Yeah, so look, a lot of our hiring is done through the graduate scheme. So there would have been a fairly tried and tested routine there, and that would have been, initial applications screened and just like brief telephone interviews, and then that would have been followed up at the next level would have been, done by video, so you kind of get a feel for people, because obviously the telephone, you can't tell if somebody's online and just reading off your website, for example, whereas you can kind of tell if they're reading from their notes on video. But yeah, I mean, that just that would have been the tried and tested format. I guess probably what we did was we maybe broadened the scope of interviewers as well, just to so for more of what I'll call the lateral hires, so the people who are coming in with some experience and not coming in as a group of people. That would have all been done by video, and maybe a couple of rounds of video. But again, for our very senior hires, we would have where the restrictions permitted it, we might have done where they had to give presentations, something similar to tonight. If we couldn't do it, in an office environment where they could come in and formally present to the panel, they would have presented, via Teams, sharing screens and doing their presentation. So.
Okay, well, I'll ask one last question then. Do you think this has made business faster? Are you finding, you had mentioned earlier about getting hold of people and getting in contact. Do you find that, your business development even maybe is a bit quicker than it previously was as a result of the lack of travel and the, slightly easier to get hold of people at times?
That's a very good question. I don't know if it has made it faster. You probably would have found that we have more access to people. I can really only speak for the industry that I work in, and so we service global investment banks, and trying to help with some of their more back office related functions as opposed to their core businesses, them out doing business. It's sort of after they've done business or to facilitate them doing business. That's where we try and help them. And that industry is a real relationship-based industry. So, existing clients, it is easier to maintain the relationship and keep it strong. But new clients, that's much more challenging. And from that perspective, a lot of our development has been through our existing client network. And whilst we have taken on some new clients, we might have been doing quite a lot of work with them over the last 2 to 3 years to try and convert them to a client. And I think that would be, this was to become the absolute norm. That would be the biggest challenge in our industry, because it is such a relationship-based industry. So that personal interaction is still important and will always be important, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. Brilliant. Great. Well, thank you very much for that, Rolly. Really appreciate your time this evening, and thank you for everyone listening in. It sounds like we've got a good audience this evening, so I'm glad that we won out over Coronation Street in a few people's houses this evening.
I'd like to thank you as well, the Alpha CMI, and thank everyone who joined us this evening. If you're a member of CMI, you can log in into Management Direct using the link in the live chat, also via the website, where you can find a wide range of exclusive and practical development resources. If you're not yet a member, you can join our community via the link that's also in the live chat and gain full access to the Management Direct portal. Please do sign up to the free CMI newsletter for the latest trends and tips for managers and leaders. Thank you again, Rolly, for sharing your insight and expertise with us. And thank you, Gemma. I'd like to wish you all a lovely evening.
Thank you.